Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Kennedys in the World, How Jack, Bobby, and Ted Remade America's Empire, by Lawrence J. Haas, narrated by David Vries. Prologue, September 1939. You can't trust the German Navy, the bruised, burned, and distressed American survivors of the Athenia, the British passenger liner that the Nazis had sunk with a torpedo, screamed at Jack Kennedy. At just 22 on this September evening of 1939, Jack was in a tough spot. Joe Kennedy, the U.S. ambassador in London, had sent his son, who was on leave from Harvard while working for his father, to Glasgow, Scotland, to talk to the nearly 300 stranded American survivors. After setting off for a leisurely journey across the Atlantic to Montreal, they spent a rainy, cold night in lifeboats, with some of them frantically bailing water out of their leaking boats with their shoes. It was more than 2 days after their frightening ordeal until someone from America's embassy came to see them, and as one 19-year-old survivor put it, the person who did was this kid who looked younger than I was. Now, this kid was telling a gathering of nearly 200 of them that they would sail to the United States, but President Roosevelt would not provide a military convoy to protect them. You will be safe in a ship flying the American flag, Jack explained. Under international law, a neutral ship is safe. The harried survivors weren't buying it, however. A convoy is imperative, insisted Thomas McCubbin, a gray-haired man from Montclair, New Jersey. 90 destroyers have just been commissioned by the United States Navy, and surely they can spare us a few. $6 billion of United States Navy, and they cannot do this for us? Another survivor noted that 2 years earlier, the whole Pacific Fleet was sent to find Amelia Earhart. We definitely refuse to go until we have a convoy, added a college student. You have seen what they will do to us. Upon hearing back from Jack, Joe Kennedy told Secretary of State Cordell Hull in a diplomatic dispatch that the survivors were in a terrible state of nerves, and suggested that Washington send a convoy or prepare to face publicity and criticism of the government that would be unbelievable. As it turned out, the ambassador later arranged for them to return home safely on a U.S. merchant ship. Why, however, did Joe send Jack to Glasgow in the first place? To be sure, the young Kennedy acquitted himself quite well. He visited the survivors in hotels and hospitals, and until he relayed the news to a large group that FDR wouldn't send a convoy, he charmed them with his warm smile and soft touch. Pictured at one meeting, he sat behind a table with an earnest look on his face. He was the schoolboy diplomat, as the London newspapers labeled him, an ambassador of mercy who displayed a wisdom and sympathy of a man twice his age. Returning to the embassy, he kept working for the survivors and clashed with bureaucrats who didn't seem to share his sense of urgency. Nevertheless, Jack wasn't the logical person for the role. He held no government position, so he could only listen to the survivors and promise to relay their views to his father. To them, his arrival was as much insulting as reassuring. Perhaps as Joe Kennedy considered the situation and weighed the possibilities, he wasn't all that interested in finding the best person to greet the survivors. Perhaps instead, he saw an opportunity to continue grooming Jack as he would Bobby and Ted for prominent roles on the world stage. That, after all, was a task to which Joe and Rose Kennedy had devoted themselves ever since the boys were young. We know a lot about Jack, Bobby, and Ted Kennedy. From books, movies, and, if we're old enough, memories, we know about their ambitions and achievements, struggles and setbacks, scandals and peccadillos. We see their faces, hear their voices, recall their landmark moments. They spent most of their lives on the public stage, and they occupy a sizable place in our national consciousness. Nevertheless, we continue to learn more about the brothers, just as we learn more about other iconic figures of our past, no matter how many historians have made them the subject of inquiry. The latest reflections of friends and colleagues and the opening of more records offer the raw material for new insights. The passage of time inspires fresh perspectives about the events of yesteryear. The Kennedys in the world tell an untold story about Jack, Bobby, and Ted, about a fascinating and, over time, hugely consequential aspect of their lives. From an early age, the brothers developed a deep understanding of the different peoples, cultures, and ideologies around the world, a keen appreciation for the challenges they presented for the United States, and a strong desire to reshape America's response to them. Once the brothers assumed power, each put a distinct mark on the American empire. In their more than 6 decades on the public stage, from Jack's election to the House in 1946 to Ted's death from brain cancer in 2009, America was what it remains today, the world's greatest power, with roles and responsibilities that stretch across the planet. So as the brothers remade America's empire, they invariably changed the world, because they proved so influential in shaping the U.S. global role. Their story provides a telling window into the evolution of America's post-war empire. What drove the boys to focus on the world at large and, once they assumed power, to shape America's role in it? From their childhoods in the first half of the 20th century, Jack, Bobby, and Ted Kennedy were prodded by the ruthless, demanding, win-at-all-costs Joe and his cold, distant, schoolmarmish wife, Rose, to learn about the world, urged to care about it, and told they could shape America's role in it. So too was Joe Jr., the oldest son who would die during World War II at just 29, before he could fulfill the sky-high expectations for him and leave his own mark on the world. Joe and Rose led discussions with the boys about global events over meals, and Joe invited prominent figures to dine with them and enrich the conversations. He wrote to the boys about global events when he or they were away and sent them to travel overseas when they were old enough, arranged meetings for them with the world's leading figures, and secured jobs for them as foreign correspondents so they could position themselves as global thinkers and relay their thoughts to would-be constituents back home. Joe focused on his sons because he assumed that in the male-dominated world of the early 20th century, they were the ones who would apply the insights they gleaned over dinner to shape the world. "My work is my boys," he told a friend on the golf course, and he behaved that way. To be sure, the family chatter about events abroad influenced the Kennedy girls as well, and as norms changed and opportunities arose, they too made their mark on the world. Eunice Kennedy Shriver founded the Special Olympics and advocated for children with special needs at home and abroad, and Jean Kennedy Smith served as America's ambassador to Ireland in the 1990s and worked closely with Ted to help bring peace to Northern Ireland. Nevertheless, it was Jack, Bobby, and Ted who bore the burden of expectation most heavily, who attained the highest offices, and who wielded the greatest power. As they grew from boys to men, all 3 brothers traveled widely, sometimes with one another, but more often with mentors, friends, or colleagues. They met with kings and czars, prime ministers and diplomats. They visited war zones and discussed conflicts with military officials. They walked streets and observed everyday life, and they developed insights into peoples, lands, and cultures that they later put to good use. They became gifted writers with a sharp turn of phrase and an eye for telling detail. Their notes, foreign dispatches, and other writings were rich in insight about the history, culture, and problems of other countries, and in turn about America's challenges in working with them. The relationships among the brothers evolved, and that too influenced their work in remaking America's global role. We remember the Kennedys as a tightly knit clan, but for the brothers, the story is far more complicated. They were raised in privilege, driven to win, and challenged to measure up to one another, all of which nurtured several core Kennedy-esque traits in each of them. They were ultra-competitive in whatever they contested, tireless in whatever they pursued, demanding on those who served them, courageous to the point of recklessness, and presumptuousness to the point of audacity. Through early childhood, they battled deep-seated insecurities about winning the respect of their overbearing father, who had set high standards for them, chastised them when they fell short, and pitted one against the other. They were hardly carbon copies of one another, however. Their places in a loud, rambunctious clan of 9 kids, Jack the second, Bobby the 7th, and Ted the last, and the distinct expectations placed upon each of them shaped their personalities. So too did their long periods alone as their parents shipped them off to different boarding schools. In their youth, they didn't know each other all that well, and when they were together for summers and holidays, their personalities didn't always mesh. Jack, who was happy and outgoing, found Bobby, who was awkward, moody, and 8 years his junior, tough to be around, and sometimes avoided him. By contrast, Jack felt an immediate bond with Ted, who was 14 years his junior, and assumed the role of mentor to him. Ted worshipped Jack, but somewhat at a distance, for he didn't know him well in his youth because the two were often apart. Bobby and Ted were often apart as well, but they spent more time with one another as youngsters than either of them spent with Jack, and at important moments, Bobby looked out for his younger brother. As the boys became men, all 3 came to know, like, and respect one another far more. They also more fully embraced the dictum of their father, a man embittered by the anti-Irish Catholic bigotry he had faced and wary of the wider world, to rely on one another more than anyone else. Jack and Bobby developed an unshakable bond during 7 weeks together as young men in the Middle East and Asia in 1951, a bond that proved crucial as they steered the nation through disaster at the Bay of Pigs and peril during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bobby and Ted grew tighter after Jack's death, and, as senators, schemed together as they broke with Lyndon Johnson over Vietnam and other global challenges. Their views about America's global role evolved considerably, due both to their experiences and to the nation's evolving challenges. Jack, a man of charm and wit, depth and insight, energy and action, was the Cold Warrior par excellence. He fully embraced the Cold War consensus of his time that America's top global challenge must be to contain Soviet-led communism, and he rewrote America's foreign policy to fight the Cold War more effectively. As he overcame dire illness and acute pain to reach the pinnacle of power, he worried that his nation would lack the comparable toughness to contain the Soviets. The most cerebral of the brothers, he was a man of uncommon intelligence. As a House member and senator, he built a national reputation as a creative thinker on foreign affairs, delivered speeches that were works of depth and poetry. As president, he was forced to grow quickly, to overcome an odd mix of personality, overconfidence in mastering the job, but insecurity in acting decisively at key moments. After learning valuable lessons from such early missteps as the Bay of Pigs fiasco, he skillfully resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis, defended America's presence in Berlin, secured a limited test ban treaty with the Soviets, and laid the groundwork for more arms control which he had hoped to pursue. He came to doubt his early decision to make a stand against communism in Vietnam, and sent strong signals that he would withdraw after he presumably won re-election in 1964. Shortly before his death, he was rethinking his hardline policies toward China and Cuba. Haunted by his harrowing experience in the Pacific during World War II, and fearful that miscalculation in Washington or Moscow would trigger nuclear war, he struggled to avoid war with the Soviets while protecting America's interests. Jack applied insights from his travels and his voracious reading during his many long illnesses to push America's foreign policy in a starkly new direction. He believed the Cold War would be won or lost not in Europe, but in the developing world, where restive populations were deciding between democracy and loyalty to the United States, or communism and loyalty to the Soviet Union. Rather than support right-wing dictators and Europe's colonial governments, he wanted to nourish U.S. ties to grassroots populations, for he thought that was a better way to compete with the Soviets and Chinese over the long term. As a senator, he ruffled feathers abroad by urging Europe to free its colonies. As president, he created the Alliance for Progress for Latin America and the Peace Corps for the world, showered more foreign aid on new nations in Africa, and met with their leaders. Jack's desire to improve America's global image also drove his efforts to address its racial problems at home, which were making nations of color hesitant to develop strong ties to the United States. Throughout Jack's life, Bobby and Ted were Cold Warriors as well. In the 1950s, Bobby worked on foreign policy for Senator Joe McCarthy, a red-baiting Wisconsin Republican and close family friend. He traveled across far-flung Soviet republics with Supreme Court Justice William Douglas, another family friend, and returned to disparage Moscow in speeches, interviews, and writings over its human rights abuses and economic backwardness. As Jack's closest confidant, he helped steady JFK's foreign policy after the Bay of Pigs, spearheaded the administration's subsequent efforts to topple Cuba's Fidel Castro, and worked closely with Jack to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis. To improve America's global image, he worked with Jack on civil rights and toured 14 countries in Europe and Asia in early 1962 as a goodwill ambassador. Also in the 50s, Ted toured Europe with a friend, traveled across Africa with one of his Harvard instructors, and capped off his Africa excursion by meeting Jack for a sail on the Mediterranean and sharing his observations about the continent. He sought an arms control position in JFK's administration, but Jack rejected the idea as a bad career move for Ted, who was thinking about running for office down the road. Instead, Ted returned to Africa at Jack's suggestion and then traveled across Latin America and Europe before running successfully for the Senate in 1962 as a Cold War hawk. After Jack died, LBJ took over and the world changed. Bobby and Ted changed with it. They evolved from Cold War hawks into leading liberal doves and drove America's foreign policy in starkly new directions. Bobby, a dark, often tortured figure, emerged from months of trauma after Jack's death as very much a new man. No longer constrained by Jack's views or subservient to his ambitions, he could take a fresh look at America's role in a world of new challenges and chart his own course. While Jack became a more seasoned leader over the years, Bobby became more of a revolutionary in rolled-up sleeves and a loose tie as he traveled the world and witnessed the horrid conditions in which many lived and worked. For Bobby, the political was also the personal, for he loathed LBJ and deemed him a crude, uncouth, and altogether unworthy successor to his suave, dynamic, and intellectual brother. Although Vietnam was the issue over which the two fought most fiercely, it was over Latin America where the first break between them on foreign policy occurred. Bobby resented LBJ's decision to rewrite Jack's approach to the region and opposed his decision to send thousands of troops to the Dominican Republic to quell a grassroots uprising. Bobby changed not just because Jack was gone and he could be himself, but because the world changed. The more that Vietnam, a Cold War venture for Jack, descended into horror and stalemate, the more Bobby questioned the venture, its relationship to the Cold War, and his previous support for it. Bobby wasn't the first leader to question LBJ's policies in Vietnam, but as the presumptive heir to Jack's presidential throne with a broad national following, he was the most important. He was no less a critic of communism, but he now viewed Vietnam as a much bigger problem for America than the Cold War. While Jack had worried about his nation's toughness to confront the Soviets, Bobby worried about its moral character as it slaughtered innocents with bombs and bullets in Vietnam. Bobby was now a far different person from the one who had crudely questioned the courage of JFK's foreign policy advisers and pushed them relentlessly to topple Castro after the Bay of Pigs. A former Cold Warrior, he played a larger role than anyone else in destroying the Cold War consensus, leaving the world more unsettled and the country more divided over America's global role. Ted, too, discarded his Cold War-centric outlook and broke with LBJ over Vietnam, but more slowly than Bobby, owing to their differences in personality and in how they approached politics. Though smart, Ted was far less a deep thinker than Jack, far less likely to quote history and sprinkle poetry through his speeches. Though passionate, he was far less a man swept by passion than Bobby, the former altar boy, who saw foreign policy and most everything else in terms of black and white, good and evil. Ted, however, was the family's best politician. Cheery, garrulous, and ruggedly handsome, he was a glad-handing, backslapping, happy warrior who inherited his skills from his maternal grandfather, John Honey Fitzgerald, a former Boston mayor with whom he spent much time as a youngster. Unlike the impatient Jack and Bobby, Ted approached the Senate not as a way station to higher office, but as an ideal place to do fulfilling work over the long term, and he deferred to his political elders and learned the Senate's Byzantine rules so he could more easily turn high-minded ideas into legislative achievements. To an uncommon degree, Ted could tap the levers of power, build coalitions, turn dreams into reality, and achieve results on foreign policy even when opposed by the president, who is always the nation's most powerful figure on foreign policy. He spearheaded the successful drives to impose sanctions on South Africa over apartheid, end proxy wars with the Soviets in Latin America, and make peace in Northern Ireland. In his low-key efforts that haven't received nearly the attention they deserve, he was remarkably successful in convincing Moscow and Beijing to free scores of political dissidents. He was a singularly influential voice on foreign affairs for 4 decades after Bobby's death, as America searched in vain for a consistent global role around which the nation could rally. With Ted, our untold story about the 3 brothers ends on a surprising note. Of the 3, he was the least likely to succeed, due to the wayward ways of his youth and his propensity for self-inflicted wounds in adulthood. In the end, with his long Senate tenure, extraordinary political skills, and distinct imprint on so many of America's leading foreign policy challenges, he probably exerted a greater long-term impact on remaking America's global role than either Jack or Bobby. Proud of one another, the brothers often quoted one another when making a point. After Jack's death, Bobby regularly used Jack's words in his own speeches, while Ted echoed both Jack and Bobby. Notwithstanding the differences that emerged among them, they shared certain views and pursued certain goals throughout their lives. As Washington began to lead the free world after World War II, all 3 discarded the isolationism that their father stubbornly retained. They believed that America must play a prominent global role, and that it could serve as a beacon for others to emulate. The brothers feared war, favored diplomacy, and sought to control the world's deadliest weapons. Jack considered his limited nuclear test ban treaty with the Soviets his proudest achievement, and Bobby and Ted sought to build on his legacy by pursuing arms control and a comprehensive test ban. They all were deeply interested in the developing world and worked hard to shape America's role in it. Throughout Jack's life, they thought the developing world was central to America's prospects in the Cold War. After Jack's death, Bobby and Ted worked to promote the human rights and improve the living standards of hundreds of millions of people across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Beyond the words they used, the brothers also sounded like one another, speaking in similar cadences and issuing similar calls to action. At times one could read a Kennedy speech and not know who had delivered it. For more than 6 decades after World War II, Jack, Bobby, and Ted Kennedy shaped broad issues of war and peace as well as the U.S. response to almost every major global challenge of their times: the Soviet Union and China, the Cold War and Cuba, the Dominican Republic and Chile, Nicaragua and El Salvador, Korea and Vietnam, South Africa and Northern Ireland, and Iraq twice. Through their experiences, we see the United States fight proxy wars with the Soviets, promote human rights, secure freedom for dissidents, win the Cold War, and bring peace to Northern Ireland. We see America face stalemate in Korea, failure at the Bay of Pigs, and disaster in Vietnam and Iraq. We see the nation struggle over China, Latin America, South Africa, and other hotspots. The Kennedy story provides a window into our time as well. That's because America remains what it was in their time, a superpower in search of its most appropriate global role and how best to perform it. Should America protect itself and do little else? Should it also ensure global peace, promote freedom and democracy, confront autocrats, assist dissidents? What should it do when its goals collide? We have no easy answers, but the experiences of Jack, Bobby, and Ted offer lessons for today and beyond. Part 1. 1. Like carbonated water. The people here keep saying their chin is up and that they can't be beaten, Ambassador Joe Kennedy wrote to his 23-year-old son Jack from London on the late afternoon of September 10, 1940, with air raid sirens blaring outside. But the people who have had any experience with these bombings don't like it at all. As Hitler's Luftwaffe strafed London, Joe sent separate letters to Jack, Bobby, and Ted, who were back in America with the family over the course of 2 days to relay his thoughts about the war. He was keenly sensitive to their different ages, so he tailored his letters to what he thought each could absorb intellectually and handle emotionally. He was most blunt with Jack, a young man of unusual depth, who had already written the best-selling Why England Slept about Britain's reluctance to rearm in the 1930s. More explanatory with Bobby, an awkward and insecure boy of 14 who had long craved a deeper engagement with his father, and most nurturing with Ted, who was just 8, and, as the youngest of 9 children, the object of much family doting. "I am feeling very well," Joe told Jack before defending his isolationist views, which had grown increasingly controversial in America as the Nazi threat grew more menacing. "The only thing I am afraid of is that I won't be able to live long enough to tell all that I see and feel about this crisis. When I hear these mental midgets, USA, talking about my desire for appeasement and being critical of it, my blood fairly boils. What is this war going to prove, and what is it going to do to civilization? The answer to the first question is nothing, and to the second, I shudder even to think about it." To Bobby, he expressed his bitterness that the iron-willed Winston Churchill, who had replaced Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister in May, wouldn't negotiate with Hitler, and he mused hopefully that perhaps Churchill's reign wouldn't last long. "The government here is still very popular," he wrote, "and Churchill is of course the god of all. Now, how long that will last when people, like those in the East End of London today, are homeless and jobless, it is difficult to say. My opinion is that the people who just see this bombing from afar and who aren't direct sufferers from it are standing up very well, but those who have lost their homes, their friends, and their jobs are not much different from other poor unfortunates who have suffered this air attack. Therefore, what the future of the government here will be, one can't say, at least for the time being." To Ted, he was warmer and more reassuring. "I don't know whether you would have very much excitement during these raids," he wrote. "I am sure, of course, you wouldn't be scared. But if you heard all these guns firing every night and the bombs bursting, you might get a little fidgety. I am sure you would have liked to be with me and seen the fires the German bombers started in London. It is really terrible to think about, And all those poor women and children and homeless people down in the East End of London all seeing their places destroyed. I hope when you grow up, you will dedicate your life.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?